Welcome to Bleach Revisited. This is Carcore Gold. As always, we'll be rereading through the chapter of Bleach, revisiting it, and I'll be providing analysis, response, and talking about how it connects to the larger whole of Bleach. Today we'll be reading through chapter 18. So, let's begin. This is chapter 18, June 17th. OP2 doesn't smile much anymore. When was it that he stopped smiling? Bleach, Chapter 18, June 17th. OP2 doesn't smile much anymore. I met him when we were 4, at the dojo we used to go to. He had the brightest hair and the biggest smile, and the most beautiful mother. He always held her hand. He was scrawny and smiled all the time, a total wimp. He was really weak too, and when he lost, he'd start crying. In fact, I was the first one in the dojo to make him cry. Just one high kick. Took me less than 10 seconds. But as soon as he saw his mother when she came to pick him up, he'd get this big grin on his face. I hated that. I mean, what kind of boy smiles when he loses? I'd see that grin and think, what a baby, clinging to his mommy. But he seemed so happy. His smile was sweet. That's how he was in the beginning. Ugh. This hill is hard. Not for me. Come on, Yuzu! You can do it! Let Daddy show you how! Look, I'll walk the rest of the way on my hands! Do not make eye contact. Attention will only encourage him. Not true. I don't need attention. I'm self-motivated. Run! Whoa! Daddy slipped! Polka dots. Vanish to the ends of the earth. Head kick. Wipeout. Due to Daddy's wipeout, there will be great volatility in the Tokyo stock market. Go back to listed stocks. Jeez. It's June, but it's already scorching. This day. Another June 17th, but so different from that one. Hey, another visitor. For real? Is she here to see Mommy too? Maybe. Hey, she's turning this way. What in the name of all that's magical is she doing here? She's waving. A friend of yours, Ichigo? No, never seen her before. Not ever. Never. She looks kind of familiar. Oh, now I remember. We were best friends in junior high, like brother and sister. It's been so long. Give us a moment to reminisce. Alone. I'll just go set her straight. You guys go ahead to Mom's grave. Set her straight? Ha. Aha! Aha what? Well, he's getting to that age. What? What age? Karen, no! Maybe we need to give him some space. What are you doing here? Relax. You'll need my help if a hollow shows up. You didn't have to. Couldn't you have been a little sneakier? Sorry, I didn't think. Hey, are you mad? No, I'm curious. She was killed. Right? You said your mother was... No, I didn't. Who killed her? I didn't say that. Just drop it. You told me you saw spirits from a young age, so answer one question for me. Could your mother have been killed by a hollow? It is possible. If you had enough spiritual energy to be able to see ghosts as a little child, a hollow that came after you might have accidentally... No! No way! You don't know. Why does everything have to be about hollows with you? It's ridiculous. To blame it on it. It's not what happened. There's no frickin' Hollow, okay? So just leave it alone. No. No way. What's she doing here? Who? Ichigo? Ichigo? No one's there. Did she run away? Or... Ichigo! His mother died when he was 9. I was only 9 myself. I didn't understand. Anyway, he was 9, but I still clinging to mommy like a baby chimp. Then she died. He didn't show up at school for a while, so I went looking for him. I found him by the river where his mother died, walking around with his little backpack from morning to night, like he was looking for her. When he got tired, he'd squat down for a while, and then he'd get up and continue his search, every day, from morning to night. I couldn't stand to see Ichigo like that. Why'd you run? What? It wasn't a hollow that killed my mom. It was me. Dressed unusually plain today. Wonder why? You'll find out in the last episode of this volume. That's it for Bleach Chapter 18. Let's get into a little bit more of what's going on here. A little bit of analysis as we get some complications on this story arc. As always, the June 17th kind of flashback bit starts one page before. So here, we get to see a little bit more in this chapter of Ichigo, of him dealing with this trauma, and I got a good bit to talk about in regards to that. By the way, in regards to the last episode, I was talking about like really using like the telephone and the moon as these different iconographies that are really recognizable in Bleach, really evoking like the urban setting as well as like this sense of the supernatural present. And after going back and rewatching the trailer for the final arc being animated, that's the very first shot in the trailer. Is not just the telephone poles, which I remember that, like the power lines or whatever they are. It's not just a shot there, but it's also the moon with the swept clouds. So I don't think it's something that people talk about or like even maybe consciously recognize that much. But it's like that iconography, the imagery is so evocative, and it's used so much within Bleach. So it's kind of interesting to see. And I don't think we catch either of them in this chapter, but certainly was present in the previous one. But I've got another thing that came up too that I was thinking about, but I'll talk about that when we get the chapter page. But the first thing that we get here is that it clearly was around the death of his mother that Ichigo stopped smiling, stopped having his kind of happy demeanor, right? And this is what expresses that, because Tatsuki is kind of explaining to Orihime that Ichigo used to smile a lot, right? That he used to be wears emotions far more openly, but then after his mother passed away, that's not the case. And so now, whenever they saw him smiling at school in the previous chapter, it's easy to see that that's not who he is, that he's putting on a front, and that this is kind of, this trauma has sort of left him a different person. Here we get it figures looks a little bit more like a younger Ichigo and Tatsuki. Maybe meant to be like the way that like the age that they actually are. I mean, like they're 15. Come on, but both of them pretty roughed up because different fights. As we come to learn, they both went to the same gym and took I assume karate or some sort of martial arts lessons together. She mentions being the Vale Tudo, but yeah, interesting. But very clearly different uniforms, so I gotta assume that these were meant to like maybe represent them younger, or alternatively it's just Kubo playing with uniforms. Who knows? Anyway, big thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't bring up that much last chapter, but I think is pretty important, is the significance of this all being, framed around this date, the June 17th. So, um, like whenever I talk a lot about trauma, of course, in this, not just in this arc, but I'm going to probably bring it up a lot in Bleach, because Bleach is a lot about dealing with the trauma of losing people who are close to you, right? About death and how that affects us and the bonds we have with other people. That's pretty core to a lot of what's going on in Bleach. So one big thing is, of course, bringing up this date, and so kind of getting into the nature of trauma, right? It's whenever something unexpected happens that like really challenges your sense of control over the world, your sense of like stability, you know. And typically, we're just hardwired. The way that we survive is to remember when those things happen, so we can avoid those circumstances again. That's why it's easy to remember, things that happen to you that are worse than things that were better, because we're the way that we are structured as living creatures is that in order to continue to survive, we need to remember the things that were dangerous, the things that threatened us, so that we can avoid them. And then, whenever it comes to things that are good, it's like, well, yeah, you're just like a monkey person. You can go eat a fruit if you need like a hit of serotonin or whatever, right? Um, yeah, so there's that aspect, but so because of that, because of the nature of how we've evolved, and because of how these traumatic events really punctuate a space with us mentally, it's really easy for traumatic events to essentially create this before and after effect for a lot of people. Like, and clearly here we have this, this chapter especially focuses on this before and after of Ichigo's mother dying, and how that's affected him, right? And so that's why typically, whenever we talk about traumatic events, we tend to talk about them in regards to a date or a time, right? So, I mean, obviously, one big one that's in the cultural consciousness, especially if you live in the United States and you're, you know, older than 20 now. I don't even know how, there's kids that are in high school now that haven't even lived through this and I've only heard of it. But 9/11, was a huge thing in American history. The September 11th terrorist attacks. And like so much change for the country and also for foreign relations for America after that kind of national trauma. But you hardly ever hear it referred to as anything other than September 11th, 9/11, the September 11th terrorist attacks. Like, it's always referred to by that like date, right? Because one, it's like a clear cut, like clearly that's referring what you're referring to, but two, it provides this frame of this is exactly when this happened. This is this punctuated moment in time that we can clearly, delineate between before this happened, whenever we felt like, maybe as a country we were safer or whatever. Hardly, but that's, beside the point. To like this time after, right? And so that's the case in general with trauma, is that again, it tends to give us a way of punctuating time, of thinking about time kind of in this way of before and after, of kind of these specific moments that are rooted and kind of give us this sense of how far away or relevantly close we are. And also, in a lot of ways, this kind of memorialization, because we get that here too, where on June the 17th, Ichigo doesn't go to school, right? His family goes and visits his mother's grave. They all go out together, and Tatsuki knows that, so this is clearly like a ritual for his family. I think that too all plays into it. Like, it's obviously it's a mode of grieving and it's a mode of moving past, but it's also of I think a bit of dealing with the fact that you clearly have this moment that you're playing, like this distinct time that you're paying homage to, and that like that specific date becomes significant whenever otherwise it really wouldn't be, right? And I think about this all the time with like holidays and like things like that, right? You think about, because recently, as of recording this is after Christmas, before New Year's. But we think about that time as like, oh man, why is it like Christmas that we give and exchange gifts? It could be any time of the year. Like that date is fairly arbitrary. Um, Same thing with like, I get into my head sometimes. I'll get kind of bummed out. Like, for instance, this New Year, I don't have any plans. I don't have anyone in my life to really share this New Year's with, unfortunately, and that's been a kind of drastic change from the last couple of years. And it's easy to kind of think to yourself, oh man, I don't have anyone to share this special day with, right? But that day is arbitrary. That time is arbitrary. um it's like, in the realistic scope of things, it's all constructed. It's all just imagined significance. I mean, that day normally, like, the sun's going to go up and down. It's just another calendar day, another day like any other day, right? um but as people, we construct this idea, this notion of a calendar and of time and of dates holding a significance, especially so that we can mark important events, right? And what's a more important event than these traumatic events, because of everything that we've been talking about? So that instead, like all of that sort of like connection that we have, both artificial and lived, and traumatic, that all informs how we live our lives, how we construct ourselves and think about each other, as well as time, as well as everything. So, in a lot of ways, that's all bound up in this. This is why I think, using that specific date is very evocative for this entire arc, and that's why it will continue to be used throughout the entire arc. But that June 17th, because it immediately keys us into this being a traumatic moment that, like all these other traumatic moments where we have a specific date in mind, you know, it's this moment that things change for Ichigo, right? It's the significant moment in his life. It's this sort of pain that he's got to live with for the rest of his life, and then he's got to reconcile in these different ways, and that's really what's grown him as a character. So yeah, just a little bit on like the reason why this using the date, I think, is effective, especially. And like especially marking it, like, instead of just like writing out like June 17th or doing 6/17, to really denote it as a date specifically, I think is clever. It really puts us in that mindset, like I said, of really thinking about this as a significant traumatic dated event with a clear cut before and after. Anyway, neat stuff. I know it's very minor, but just analysis wise, I think it's, it speaks a lot towards, because you could call this anything, right? You could be like the day everything changed or whatever, and I don't think it would have the same effect um, at all. So I think it's neat what Kubo's kind of doing there, and he's really keyed into this idea of how trauma affects people and how people deal with trauma. And again, that's very core to the identity of Bleach, right? That's very core to Ichigo's identity as well. But here we get them as kids, which is pretty cute. So we get, 4-year-old Tatsuki and 4-year-old Ichigo. As we come to learn, since his mother passed away whenever he was 9, they knew each other for 5 years, and then his mother passed away, and it's been 6 years since then, right? I was kind of looking at, like, is that Perdition? I don't know. That would have another E. Bruce Lee poster, you know. Just kind of wondering what's the posters. I assume this is Tatsuki's room, because I don't think Orihime's room was aligned this way. I don't think she had a bed at all, actually. I think she sleeps on a futon, at least from what I could tell from her room. Nor does she have these posters. So we have to assume that this is Tatsuki's place that Orihime has gone over to. But yeah, we get this kind of history of how Ichigo used to be like he was this really weak, kid. He would cry all the time, but whenever he'd see his mother, he'd smile. So he had this very strong connection to his mom. In a lot of ways, like, Tatsuki kind of resented that, right? She says, like, I hated that. Like, what kind of boy smiles when he loses? You know. that like Totsuki's idea of like masculinity and of strength is in putting on this tougher face, and of, like, whenever you lose, it being, a significant loss, but Ichigo's able to move past that loss because of this connection that he has, right? Which, as we know, is pretty tragic, because he's lost that person. But yeah, she kind of, sees that he's like a baby. She relates it to like this, like, because he's more innocent, right? He's maybe naive, or like she's saying, like, babyish, right, clinging to his mom, but that's what made him happy. Like, he was very sweet and very earnest. And that, of course, changed, right? We hop back over to Ichigo's family, and I it's interesting that we're like left with this kind of cliffhanger to this story of like in the beginning, as we're learning a little bit more. I think also framing this, I say not framing like visually, but because certainly there's a lot of visually stuff. Like we've talked about characters kind of facing away as they talk about these certain things, and us not getting their expression that much, and so we're certainly getting a little bit more of Tatsuki sharing how she feels all about this, and seeing a little bit more how she feels and like how she expresses her feelings, which is neat. But I think it's really effective because we're in the same place as an audience as Orihime is, right? Where we know something's up with Ichigo, we don't know exactly what it is, and so Orihime is getting Tatsuki to tell her what it is, just as Tatsuki is telling us. So it's an organic way for us to get this kind of information, because these characters are having this conversation that kind of is about this person they both care about, that they're connected to. Again, doesn't pass the Bechdel test, which is the whole, you know, uh, is it truly like a good representation of women, unless there's at least two like women in a scene where they talk about anything other than a man or whatever it is. Um, Whatever. I don't think Bleach is particularly sexist. Uh, it especially in this whole arc is about Ichigo, so it's like, yeah, I'd really hope that any characters off screen are kind of speaking towards Ichigo. But something that I always think about whenever they isolate the kind of female characters to talk about something, it's like, okay, well, how much of this is doing like development for their sake versus just kind of propping up these other characters through the eyes of these female characters, right? And like how these characters are being used, and how gender is essentially being used in different ways. Because obviously all that stuff kind of informs the narrative, and it grows out of societally how we, try to tell our stories and try to convey, all of these kind of aspects. But yeah, I like that. Yeah, Yuzu and Karen are ahead of Ichigo and Ishin. Clearly, Ichigo's kind of, not really caring about getting there quickly. He's just taking his own time, kind of backgrounded, more quiet than usual. Ishin is kind of high energy. He's really like kind of maybe trying to put his family in better spirits. Haha. But yeah, gonna walk up these stairs with his hands. We get a little bit more of their personalities here, of the entire family and them being goofy. The calling out his daughter's panties having polka dots on them is pretty rude. Uh, he deserves to be kicked. I don't know. Anyway, I like the line about the volatility in its Tokyo stock market, and going back to listed stocks is pretty goofy. But yeah, Ichigo being really reflecting on that day, right? And how it's different from before. And of course, we get to see Rukia here because she's very curious what's going on too, right? Also, she's pretty insistent that Ichigo couldn't take a day off because, like, what if Hollows are around? But I think the bigger thing is that she's just kind of figuring out what's going on. Yeah, I like that Ichigo kind of scrambles for an excuse for how he knows Rukia. I mean, obviously, you could just be like, "Hey, we go to the same high school." Uh, he's trying to play it off, but I love that Karen kind of keys in and say like, "Hey, she seems familiar," because as we know, Karen says her memory is wiped. But at this point, I think multiple times, right? But yeah, Karen kind of points out like, oh well, Ichigo, he's 15, he's getting that age, he's noticing some women. Let's give him some space. And Ichigo's pretty upset with Rukia. You know, we get a little bit of that like, hey, I'll be here if Hollow shows up, which I think is pretty significant towards drawing our attention to like, yeah, there's probably a Hollow's probably gonna show up, right? Um, Again, kind of interesting framing here where we get this like, no, I'm curious, and we don't get attention to Rukia's face, even though everything in this shot is supposed to draw us up towards this kind of empty space behind her, which of course the next panel shows that kind of over the shoulder empty space. There's that leaf, and then Ichigo's kind of avoiding this like she was killed bit, and specifically being like, hey, drop it, no. And we don't get to see kind of what was maybe behind Rukia until again we get this like kind of larger forest shot, and then it's not until like next page really. Yeah, at the very end here we get this other character watching, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, Ichigo really insisting and like getting this kind of cocky face, right? And then being shocked by this other person that he sees is I think that all kind of works. Especially we get a lot of Ichigo kind of being like deflecting and being insistent and pushing this back on Rukia, like, oh, why is it gotta always be about hollows? Clearly Ichigo's maybe a little bit in denial or has his own sort of misgivings about what's going on. Also, the style of like long sleeve shirt under a t-shirt is so like late 90s, early 2000s, like cool fashion. I've seen that coming back here and there, and it's it throws me for a loop. But that was very much like a cool thing to do. And you didn't have shirts that were even just designed that way, that were like long sleeves, but like the color design cut off like at the sleeve, to like give it that effect. It's bizarre. Uh, anyway, but yeah, clearly notices this person. That's again, now we get that framing in that path without Ruki in the way. Um, and so like Ichigo is completely shocked, right, that there's someone else here. And so after this, we get this mention, because clearly Ichigo is like thrown off by this other person being there and watching, and he takes off, runs that way, and we get this internalization from Rukia, right? Is there's no one there? Did she run away? And that or kind of leaves us, or are that sort of leaves us with what else is Rukia thinking, right? We don't really know for sure. And we could assume, of course, it's maybe R it's a spirit, R it's a hollow, R did she like vanish? Like I'm curious, but I gotta imagine, Ruki is like Ichigo said, her mindset is on hollows. It's on this kind of supernatural, so she's gonna see things this way. And we get this intercut. We get back to Tatsuki with her hands kind of clasped. We're pulled back into that scene as she explains. And it's interesting that we get these like kind of intercut moments between what's happening over here, Ichigo like running after this figure that he's seen, Rukia chasing him, right? And kind of how Ichigo didn't show up, and she found Tatsuki found Ichigo as a kid, kind of wandering the river where his mother died, looking like he was looking for her, right? He get up and continue the search. And so, we get this sense that obviously Ichigo's really felt this loss, right? And we get even brought up after this that Ichigo could see spirits since he was young. And so we get this kind of we get this real moment of like, maybe Ichigo was looking for his mom's ghost, maybe he was looking for this other figure that he's chasing even. It's unclear. And one of the things, especially earlier, Ichigo has a pretty visceral reaction to whenever she says, like, hey, if you had enough spiritual energy as a kid, maybe the Hollow came after you and killed your mom. And clearly, like, that, like, is what sends Ichigo over the edge. The idea that he's responsible in some way for his mother's death is, like, clearly something that sets him off a bit. And then, that's got him kind of riled up. He sees this other person, and then we get the conclusion of that where Ichigo says that it was him that killed his mother, right? That he feels like he was the one responsible for it. So that's pretty huge. Whether we're supposed to interpret that as, Ichigo literally was the one that killed his mom, which seems like an impossibility. I mean, he was a 9-year-old kid, and clearly he was pretty broken up about it. So it doesn't seem like it would, be the case that he would. But maybe he was possessed. It's unclear. But I think maybe what we're maybe supposed to read it more as is just like Rukia suggested, that perhaps Ichigo is responsible for his mother's death in a way, that like this Hollow might have come after him, and he essentially feels responsible for his mom dying because she's kind of got caught up in between it. And we got that in the previous chapter, that Ichigo really wants to protect, right? That he's got this real drive to protect his family and protect others, especially to help out these spirits. And maybe a lot of that grows from, the fact that he feels really guilty about his mother dying, right? That he blames himself for her getting killed. So that's kind of interesting. That's neat stuff. And of course, there's another element there that complicates that, and that's this child that we see that is watching that isn't supposed to be here, right? So clearly there's this other character that is involved that Ichigo recognizes that's probably tied to his mother's death, right? So we're already we're left with a lot of questions here at the end of what was it, what actually happened, because we had maybe an easier assumption before, but now after all this admission from Ichigo and this introduction of this other character, it's hard to really pin down. I don't remember why Ishin's dressed more plainly. We'll have to find out in the last episode of this volume. But yeah, that's it for really kind of analyzing chapter 18. As far as kind of how I feel about it, I think it's fantastic in how it complicates kind of the initial setup that we get. I really like that we're getting a little bit more of Tatsuki. We get a little bit more of her character and how she relates to all of this and how she feels, and the sort of relationship she has with Ichigo even. And I like that also, we're getting this kind of back and forth between Rukia, of Ichigo confiding more, of Rukia realizing maybe some of the more kind of significance to all these events in Ichigo's life, why he is how he is. So yeah, overall I think it's a solid chapter as far as just building on these characters and this event in the past and building our interest moving forward, because in the previous chapter a lot of what we got was really a focus on what happened in the past, but we didn't get so much of this forward momentum in the present. And so now we have not only an introduction of a complication of the events that happened in the past, but now we also have Ichigo, recognizing this other character, and all this other stuff kind of happening in the present that's causing like a kind of more complex situation to grow into the present, and maybe even a conflict to arise there as we build that way. So yeah, neat stuff. Let's talk about spoilers. Let's talk about how this connects to Bleach at a whole, right? Let's discuss all of that. So if you're not interested in spoilers, if you don't want to hear anything beyond what's kind of going on in this chapter and the chapters before, feel free to hop out the video right now. Thanks so much for watching to this point. As always, if I put out something that you weren't aware of, feel free to give the video a like to represent that. But if you notice something that I didn't, or if you want to talk about an element of this that I didn't, or even just discuss the stuff I did, please leave a comment. I'm really excited to see what people are seeing that I don't see. So, that's the whole point of this, is to kind of get a lot of people's take on these revisiting of these chapters. Anyway, going to spoilers, going to foreshadowing, how this connects. Let me get some water. So, I'd mentioned before that I felt like there was some pretty clear imagery at the beginning with the interplay of blacks and whites and framing of the image for like Yawok's investment, right, or involvement, or like at least the imagery that we come to associate with Zangetsu. And I think especially with the way that this like darkness is kind of tearing away all around the corners, that certainly reminds me a lot of like Zangetsu's cloak, are the Almighty sort of, and how that darkness kind of sweeps out. It has a very similar kind of effect, and so that being kind of all around this younger Ichigo and consuming this past event, I think is at the very least visually connected, and where Kubo was drawing a lot of the same visual sort of ways that he wanted to represent this encroaching darkness, even if it's not meant to literally be like, hey, the Quincy King was involved, um, yeah, we, get the little opening bit, like their art. Yeah, we get like Ichigo and his tears and him crying, and obviously that ends up being kind of significant later on, especially right in his internal world, and it raining and the rain being kind of tied up into the emotions that Ichigo has. Yeah, I think that's all. This is all like kind of the beginning of that, and where we're starting to see where that is before that becomes introduced as like an inner world concept. Because it used to be that Ichigo could externalize all of these feelings and this pain, right? And so as he grows up, he learns to internalize it instead, to keep it within inside of himself, and to really kind of deal with the world in different ways, with like strength, or with like this sort of attitude. Um, Rather than kind of just expressing how he's feeling in the moment all the time. And in a lot of ways, we get how that's maybe unhealthy for him, but also we get like how like that kind of internal world, we see that the cumulative effects of him building all of that up, and the way that his internal world is depicted, which is kind of neat. So I like that, like we get this, a reflection of that like of that change that we've had in Ichigo later, which is cool. Um, that like that kind of change in his character and like how he is pretty, consistent throughout. Um, yeah, I always talked about, one of the things that I mentioned way earlier is like really Ishin kind of training his son in a lot of ways, like attacking him in the mornings, and really pushing his son to kind of develop in a lot, like like pretty much more spiritual pressure, putting him in these like kind of really dangerous situations. But he also kind of has this kind of, like I said, like this I said cheerleading his family on whenever I was doing the analysis, but this idea that like he's gonna try to inspire the others, and he'll even go to the like I'll walk on my hand the rest of my way on my hands. That like and I know this is maybe a tenuous connection, but the idea that he's willing to kind of undergo like personal humiliation, or even having a harder time at things himself if it helps other people out. And that's 100% his character, right? Like he ends up giving up his powers and his position as a captain and everything because of his connection with Masaki. And so, we still get a lot of that like enthusiasm and that kind of, like humility, kind of, in a way, that he absolutely is not a proud man at all. In fact, he's fucking goofy as hell. That certainly comes across in the way that he interacts with his daughters, which again, like I said before, are kind of very much, all of his children are essentially aspects of Masaki in a lot of ways, but also him kind of assuming this leadership role. I mean, it fits because he's the dad, right? Um, it's certainly, him kind of trying to inspire his troops or whatever, right? But at the same time, this dude was a captain, so it makes 100% sense for his mentality to be like, okay, I'm the leader. These are all these people that are underneath me. I have to show them the way to be. I have to encourage them and build them up, right? So yeah, it's neat like that. Like in the previous chapter, yeah, he's like appointing positions very much too. So it's interesting how that maybe connects. Uh, he's self motivated. Yeah, yeah. Dooba dooba doo. I don't know that there's a lot of other connections really to make other than obviously we get Shrieker showing up, and maybe I can speak a little bit towards that. Um, yeah, he'll need my help if a Hollow shows up. Obviously, we know a Hollow does. Um, but so there's kind of an interesting bit here where Rukia thinks about like so we get the Shrieker's like plunger or whatever, right? It's little decoy. Um, and that did she run away or R, right? And I kind of in analysis I was like, okay, well, what's going on with that? I think it's very much supposed to be like that, like the Hollow vanished, right? That there's like something illusory going on here. That there's something obviously supernatural, but one of the things whenever I talk about connections and parallels that these characters have, especially in the antagonists that they face, Ichigo is always dealing with, for these larger antagonistic forces, it's always some entity that deals in like manipulation and in perception and in messing with people's connections in a lot of ways too. So even this first example with Grand Fisher, right, being like this big antagonist for the first kind of human arc, right? I say big antagonist. I mean, he gets dealt with in this volume, but it's like the most significant personal enemy that Ichigo has, right? Um, that like you know with get over to this page with the little entity there that Grand Fisher uses this manipulation and will even project like people that they like other people are close to, right? That it's this manipulative, illusionist sort of foe, very much like Aizen is, right? Where Aizen will pit people against each other. He'll really manipulate people's bonds. I mean, he uses love as a means of making people weak, just like how Grand Fisher does, right? Where he'll project Ichigo's mother, or at least the image of her. This false image to really use other people's sentimentality against them. And like I said, Aizen does that with Momo and a lot of other characters. Um, and it is very much like literally his power is messing with your senses and illusion. We get that again with Tsukishima, where Tsukishima's Book of the End, he's able to kind of change people's perception of reality. And then finally with Yuha, he's able to perceive all of these timelines. And maybe he doesn't, rely on like manipulations as much as just his raw power, but he's able to because he doesn't need to manipulate others. He just manipulates the world itself. Like he could just be in whatever timeline works best for him, right? He has the power of the Almighty, and so that sort of like Ichigo constantly being up against these entities that affect and manipulate and really kind of mess with other people's bonds. And to an extent, Yawok does that through stealing all the powers of all these people, kind of heartlessly, and making these Quincy, they essentially all die. Uh, and even more so whenever he does the calls back his powers, right? And the light. I don't know what it's called. Is it Osvalin? It's so many terms in Bleach that it's hard for me to tell. But the light that basically destroys the Quincy is he basically, as Yawak takes back their powers to uh maybe again with that final enemy, he's just so powerful an entity that he doesn't rely on those illusions so much, but he still has that connection of manipulating or like very clearly messing with the bonds of others without really care towards that, and kind of shifting reality even to the reality that he prefers. So there's always been, and I mean especially obviously with Aizen, Grand Fisher, and Tsukushima, there's a much clearer connection. Um, there's always been these instances that kind of mess with the character's perceptions. That those are the entities that Ichigo often is facing in like are the major, well really are the major antagonists of Bleach, not so much that Ichigo's facing, because like with Grimmjow and Ulquiorra and all these other kind of smaller antagonists that certainly take up a lot of space and are major fights for Ichigo, um, as he's growing and all that. And like Renji, Byakuya, like all of these are still significant encounters, and represent like different kind of facets of the individual versus the society, and these other people within a society that are more willing to kind of do the bidding of others and not really personally kind of fulfill like what works for them, and like that Ichigo pits against them in a lot of ways. But I think the more sinister, like true villains, right, of Bleach, like the ones behind the scenes, always tend to be for whatever reason. I think thematically, obviously, it's the idea of, being dishonest, of manipulating others, of not having those connections and bonds, or even to an even more wicked extent, exploiting those connections and bonds that people have to each other and even to reality. Um, which is like puts them in kind of the perfect antagonistic place, not just in general because that's a shithead thing to do, right? But especially against a protagonist like Ichigo, where these connections that he has to people living and dead are like really these things that fuel him, that he like wants to fight to protect and all of that. So those that don't have something to protect are willing to sacrifice others for ideals, whenever Ichigo is very much not a man about ideals. Like, Ichigo does not give a shit about ideals. Ichigo gives a shit about actual lived connection and the connection he has to other people, and he wants to fucking protect that very real thing rather than chasing after this idealistic thing. Yeah, so that'll all come up, especially as kind of thematic beats as we go throughout Bleach, and I'll probably bring that up in a later analysis. But it's interesting here that we do get that first hint of like this being an elusive sort of power, that Ichigo is being, manipulated, that there's this clear like entity that isn't all that it seems, um, and coming back to that very, very first kind of character poem bit in the first volume, and talking about like the fear of the unknown, or like the enemy that we can't see, right? In the second volume, that was the opening bit too. Like they would fear this death if they could see it right next to them, right? And so this idea of this unseen threat, that like there's this manipulative kind of force, this sort of unseen, uh, again, entity or threat or whatever, and that's what's truly a problem, and that's what we have to kind of combat, is interesting. So yeah, a little bit of connections there. Not a lot of else going on. Ichigo certainly blaming himself and trying to take things on his shoulder is big part of his character. He learns to maybe share a little bit of that going forward. So neat. But that's it. That's it for this episode 18 of Bleach Revisited. Thanks so much for watching through the video. As always, support me in whatever way works for you. I've got the Twitter and the Patreon in the episode description. If you are so, inclined to follow either of those. But otherwise, as always, spirits are always with you. Forever with you? Spirits are forever with you. Whatever it is. Stay gold.